is boasting. In verse 16, James says, "But now you rejoice in your boastings. All such rejoicing is evil." The word boastings means an empty boaster. That is, it is a person who boasts about something he thinks he has, but he does not really have it. It's not speaking about recognizing that you're good at something. It doesn't mean that you can take satisfaction in having accomplished and being able to do things well. It goes beyond that. It goes beyond that, thinking that you have something that you don't really have. The story is told of a husband who came home from work one day and announced proudly to his wife that he'd been promoted to company vice president. "Big deal," she said. "Vice presidents are a dime a dozen. Why, the supermarket that we shop at has so many vice presidents. I'll bet they have one who is just in charge of grocery bags." And so the husband, annoyed at his wife's reply, said, "All right, I'll call your bluff." And so he picked up the phone and he dialed the grocery store. And in his most sarcastic voice, he said, "Let me speak to the vice president in charge of bags." And the end of the line inquired, "Would that be paper or plastic?" You see, friends, boasting is something you don't really have. Because any person who goes throughout life without God is just like the person who thinks he has everything when in reality he does not really have it. He lives and plans thinking that he controls his life and the future. His life is one big boast of self-sufficiency, and it is wrong, totally wrong, because such boasting is evil, because it takes no thought of God. Psalms 52:7 says, "Look at what happens to mighty warriors who do not trust God. They trust their wealth instead, and they grow more and more bold in their wickedness." See, to make plans leaving God out of the equation is pride. And we know what God thinks of pride. Pride is sin. And then fifth and finally, self-sufficiency is sin. In verse 17, James says, "Remember, it is sin to know what you ought to do and then not do it." This is a striking definition of sin. To know that we should do something and then refuse to do it. And although this statement may apply to any number of situations, James intended it to refer to the immediate preceding context. And it is like saying, "Now that I have pointed the matter out to you, you have no excuse." Knowing what should be done obligates a person to do it. You see, we tend to limit sins to specific acts, such as doing wrong. But James tells us that sin is also not doing what is right. It is a sin to lie. But it can also be a sin to know the truth and not tell it. It is a sin to speak evil of someone. But it is also a sin to avoid that person when you know that he or she needs help. It is a sin to disobey God. But it is also a sin to act without seeking his guidance. So serious is God on this matter, my friends, that as his children, he requests of us that we seek him before we make our plans in life. You parents here this morning, which of you would not want your young child to come to you and say, Mom, Dad, what's your advice in this matter? And how much more does our Heavenly Father desire that we seek his guidance before we act, before we go as
Missionary Elizabeth Elliot, whose husband, Jim Elliot, along with 4 other missionaries, were speared to death by the Auca Indians, tells of 2 adventurers who stopped by to see her, all loaded with equipment for the rainforest east of the Andes. They sought no advice. They just simply asked her for a few phrases to converse with the Indians. And in her journal she writes this: sometimes we come to God as the 2 adventurers came to me, confident, and we think well informed and equipped. But as it occurred to us, with all our accumulation of stuff, something is missing. She suggests that we often ask God for too little. We know what we need, a yes or no answer. Please do a simple question. Perhaps a road sign, something quick and easy to point the way. Then she goes on to say, what we really ought to have is the guide himself. Maps, road signs, a few useful phrases are things. But infinitely better is someone who has been there before and knows the way. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we were a little late to service. That is because I rely on Siri to get us here. See, Siri and I are no longer on talking terms because she took us to your old church, although I had typed in this address. I had been at your other church, about 4 or 5 times prior, but I had never been here. Friends, it would have been much better that I had someone who had been here before. Because they could have let me here, I wouldn't have been late. But I depended on an inferior source. That's just how it is with God sometimes. We depend on others. What do they say? What do they think? We depend on ourselves. Well, I'm kind of a happening person. I've made it in life before. I can do it again. I really don't need God. God says, no, child, no. Before you make your plans, before you make your decisions, call for me. I would ask the musicians to come back. And in conclusion, we see that self-sufficiency is planning without God. Self-sufficiency is is failure to recognize the uncertainty of life. It is failure to acknowledge God. It is boasting. It is bragging and arrogance. Self-sufficiency is sin. In the Highlands of Scotland, it is said a sheep will often wander off into the rocks and get into places that they can't get out of. The grass on these mountains are very sweet, and the sheep like it. And they will jump down sometimes 10, even 12 feet. But then they can't jump back up again. And in the distance, the shepherd can hear them bleating. And they may be there for days and days until all the grass is eaten. But the shepherd waits. He waits until they are so faint and they can't even stand anymore. And at this point, the shepherd climbs down the precipice and he puts a rope around them, and he then at that point pulls that sheep out from the jaws of death. It has been asked, why doesn't the shepherd go down right away and get the sheep? The answer is because sheep are very foolish. They would dash right over the precipice and be killed by the fall. You know, friends, that is often the way it is with man. That is often the way people are. They won't go back to God until they have no friends and everything has been lost. They're much like the prodigal son who, until he was eating the husks with the pigs, did he remember what his father had to offer. Why? Because self-sufficiency will keep them from surrendering themselves to God. The moment we quit trying to save ourselves, and the moment we are willing to let the Lord rescue us, then He will come to our aid. You know, sometimes God is just like that shepherd. He doesn't come right away because we wouldn't even allow Him to. So God waits. And in His patience He watches. This morning, as you have listened, you might say, you know, that's kind of where I'm at. I have plans. I really haven't even sought the Lord on these plans. I just kind of went ahead because, you know, I've done this before and it's kind of worked out. And I've become a little bit self-sufficient. I think I can do it by myself. I really don't need God. Friends, God says you do need me. You do need me. So as the musicians just lead us in a moment here, I'm just going to step down.
I'm going to open these altars. And if you would like prayer this morning, I'd like to just take time to pray with you. If you find yourself in a place with plans and you really haven't sought God, friend, I warn you, seek God. Seek God. If you would like prayer, I would like to pray with you. If this message has said nothing to you this morning and you have another need here this morning, I would like to pray for that also. And so I want to thank you for coming out this morning. This service is over and you're dismissed to go after the worship is done. Thank you for coming. God bless you. Pastor Clayton, I believe, will be back next week. And thank you for having us out. It's been great. If you want prayer, I do invite you to come. Thank you.